Hello and welcome to the 1/106 of a second photography podcast. Today I'm going to be talking about developing film, as in film photography. Why would you bother with film photography in the digital age? And it's a very good question. Film used to be everything. You couldn't do photography or video unless you had film. But with the advent of digital, the reasons to do film photography are diminishing. So when I used to do film photography, I started to develop my own films and I really enjoyed that, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But in terms of the benefits, I could pick up a very cheap Canon SLR, not a DSLR but an SLR, and I could easily get really good pictures with it. However, when I was doing film photography, digital was not better than film. I would say digital has surpassed film now. You get a certain look with film that you can achieve with digital. Digital does better with shadows, film does better with highlights, but you can achieve the film look just by using a Lightroom preset. Film also is initially cheaper. I picked up an SLR for 20 quid compared to what a professional body would be for digital. But then once you factor in film and once you factor in developing and the fact you can only shoot 36 images at once, it soon starts to add up. So if you want full frame, one-off, film is fine. You can pick up a roll of film between £1 and £5, but you'll only get 36 shots on it. You've then got to develop it. If you send it off to develop it, it costs a lot of money, obviously. If you develop it yourself, it's cheaper, but it's quite intensive and it can be quite difficult and you've got to know what you're doing. You can't really go wrong if you follow instructions, but it's another hassle. But I really enjoyed it. I've done pinhole photography and I really enjoyed developing my pinhole paper. So film goes in a camera, and there may be some listeners out there who've never come across film because they're below 20 or they're around the age of 20. But with pinhole, it's paper. Right, you can use film in pinhole, but it's going to be paper, and watching that develop is really quite magical. You don't watch your film develop when you develop film because it's all done inside a canister that is light-proof. The only time I would say now film beats digital, because digital has so much convenience, sharing, storing. The only time I think film beats it is when you compare equivalent sensor sizes. So a piece of film in a 35mm film canister is approximately the same size as a full frame sensor. But if you go bigger, and I talked about my pinhole photography, if you go bigger, you can't replicate that same size easily in digital. So the only time film really makes sense in the digital age, from what I can see, in my opinion, is if you're using larger sensors above 35mm film. So that would be things like medium format or pinhole or large format. Now, large format for me is too cumbersome. If you see those old films of people under a cloak taking photographs, that's large format. And while I do like tintype photography, never done it myself, but I like the idea of producing picture on a piece of metal, it's not for me, that large format photography. And again, you would need several digital shots to get that level of resolution. And then you've got the hassle with digital processing it. But with film photography, you just develop it and it's a one-off. You're working on one thing. So it's only worth doing with medium format cameras. Now, to get into medium format, you can just buy Holga and use 120 film, or you can get things like Mamiya's, Hasselblads and things like that. I've had medium format cameras and I have developed film for them, and there's no way I could achieve what I achieved with a digital. I'm not going to buy a digital medium format. It costs far too much money. No way I'm doing that. Too big, too cumbersome. Shooting film does slow you down. That a lot of people say that, and that's correct. It does slow you down. You do have to think more. You don't really have to edit your images because they're captured, they're baked in. You can do some tweaking, you can do some dodging and burning, you can develop it longer for more high contrast. The only other advantage of using film photography is the batteries. You put one battery in, it'll last you 5 years. You don't need to do any recharging. So if you were going to be away from electricity, film might be a good solution. If you weren't going to take many photos, you're out in the wilderness forever, 5 years at a time, film might be suitable. And you can even get beers that can be used to develop film because of their acidity rating. But I'm going to talk now about how to develop film. I've talked about why you might use film, and it's becoming more and more niche. I accept that. But how do we develop film? Well, first of all, film or paper, but let's call it photographic stock, is sensitive to light. So you have to not have any light around. So the first thing is you have to get the film from the camera into a developing tank without getting any light on it, because if you get light on it, you'll just have a white image. You'll lose your image completely. So you might have seen people in the old days sort of taking the film out of their camera in shade, not wanting to overexpose it. You need to wind your film back in to the canister in the camera, and then you take your film out. So you get something called dark bags, and dark bags, they have two sleeves to put your hands in, and they're just a bag that is light proof. You put your film canister and your developing tank, and you put your tools in as well in the dark bag, and you zip it up. You then put your hands in. So then you've got to open the film canister without being able to see it, and then you've got to take the film and you've got to wind it around the spools. Now that's actually really difficult, and it's a good idea to practice this with a film that you don't need, or a film that accidentally got exposed to light, or just have a practice film. So you've got to obviously wind it round the canister, and you don't want to get fingerprints on it because you'll get smudgies and that won't be very good. You don't want to crumple it because it won't develop properly and it will not be good. You've got to get it evenly in there with no problems. Once it's in the spools, you put it in the developing tank. Now obviously you're going to use chemicals, and you can load more than one film or warp more than one spool into a developing tank to save on chemicals. You don't have to fill it right up with chemicals, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So once it's in the developing tank, it's light tight, nothing can happen to it. Now you need to develop it. First thing I used to do was I used to put some water in and just give it a wash and then tip it out. The water used to come out of strained colour. I have done black and white and colour photography developing, both of them. Colour is more difficult because you've essentially got 3 layers of film that you need to develop, and there's a set way to do it. So you've got red, green and blue, and each layer needs to sort of be etched away. The science of it is very clever, but the chemicals are more harsher and more dangerous for colour photography than for black and white photography. Black and white is simple. You can of course use things like caffeinol recipes where you just use coffee, some vitamin C, and you sort of build your own developer, and that's fine. So in black and white, you're only dealing with tonality. All you're dealing with is silver iodide being reduced chemically to silver, and it's that silver that stays on the film and is fixed and causes your black. A lack of silver will cause white. Somewhere in the middle is going to be grey. Now you've got to add the chemicals. You've given it a wash of water. Now you've got to add the chemicals. You pour your developer in. Now obviously we talked about using the minimum amount of chemicals, so you've got to invert your developing tank so that the chemical washes evenly over all parts of the film. So every 30 seconds you invert it. And what you don't want air bubbles to form, so you always tap it, get rid of any air bubbles. So that means that all of the film is evenly exposed to the chemical to the same degree. Otherwise what you're doing is you're just going to put more chemical in than you need. The film part that touches the chemical the most would be overdeveloped compared to the other side, and that's not right. So you're inverting it and you're moving it about. The film you use can be developed by many different developers, or many different developing chemicals, and each one will have a set time at a set temperature. So if you heat it up, it's going to develop faster. If it's at a colder temperature, it's going to take longer to develop. I always use the time for room temperature. I didn't bother heating it up. For colour photography, you've got to put it in a water bath. You've got to have it set higher temperature than black and white. So you can do it just at room temperature. So you're inverting it every 30 seconds, giving it a knock in the developing tank, and then you want the reaction to stop, because if it doesn't stop, it will all go black. So you tip away the developer. You can reuse the developer. So you can tip it down the sink, or you can tip it in something else and save it for another time. So you can maybe use it 4 to 5 times and then you need to get rid of it. So tip it away or keep it. Then you need to put a stop bath in. So what I would do is I would tip it away. I would rinse it with water, and then I put my stop bath in. That's going to stop the reaction dead. And that's sort of a sodium thiosulfate mixture. And then, shake it, tap it, tip that away or keep it. I can't remember whether you can keep the stop bath. Then you need to put in a fixer. Now what the fixer does is the fixer sets everything essentially. Don't forget this is silver on a piece of film. Tiny silver dots, and each dot is going to be immensely small because it's been hit by a bit of light. So you don't want those dots or silver particles to come off. So you apply a fixer, and a fixer just sets it, and then you get rid of that. Do a final wash. You're going to have harsh chemicals on your film, and so from a handling point of view, you really want to wash it. You want to basically, a complete waste of water this is to put it under the tap, leave the tap running for 5 minutes. Complete waste of water, but it gets rid of the chemicals. Once you've developed it, you've stopped the reaction, you've fixed it, and you've rinsed it, you're going to hang it up to dry. If you live in a hard water area like me, you could get streaks. So you can put in sort of a rinse, which is very similar metaphorically to the rinse and in your dishwasher. Just takes streaks away. Soap sort of thing, really. Gets rid of all of the hard irons and just prevents streaks from happening. And then you're going to have to hang it up to dry. Now, film has been curled up in a canister, and film will be curled up in your developing tank. So you need to weigh the bottom to get it straight. Now, I will say most developing tanks can take rolls of 35 film or 120 film, which is the big medium format film. 120 film, I think you maybe get 10 to 16 shots on, depending on the size of your framing. I think you can get 6x6 or you can get sort of a more widescreen version, but you can fit them both in your developing tank. So once you've got your film and it's developed and it doesn't have streak, what are you going to do with it then? Well, you can store it. And in some ways, film is better than digital because it's a physical thing. You can store it as long as you store it sensibly in a folder, somewhere safe. It's going to last infinitely longer than your digital images on your hard disk, which will fail. Film has been around for probably 100 years, and old film has lasted, and prints have lasted, and paper's lasted. I don't know what happened with digital files. We haven't got a digital file that's 100 years old yet. Will it still be there in the same length of time? So now you're obviously going to want to do something with it. You could print it using photographic paper and an enlarger, but most people won't have that. You could send it off to get someone to do that, but most likely you're going to want to get it in a digital form for sending off to be printed, sharing, storing, editing, tweaking. So you'll need a flatbed scanner. You can get very high precision and industrial scanners, but I have an Epson V something, and that scans film and that does a good job. I needed to get another bit of software to get a really good scan. You will pick up little bits of hair and fibers that stick to your film. It happens. You will sometimes find scratches on your film, but you can scan it in, and once you've scanned it in, you're really pleased with the images you've got. They're really impressive because you've not only taken that, you've developed it. And the sense of achievement you get when you develop a film and it's a good picture is immense. And it's quite addictive, and that's why I did it for a bit. But I think in a digital age, it's only worth developing film if you are using medium format or pinhole or a very niche or specialist thing. I don't think it's worth doing for 35mm or smaller, because you can get smaller than 35mm. But that's me developing film. Have you developed film? Let me know. Don't forget you can check out updates to the podcast on Twitter. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud. I certainly would appreciate it if you left a review for this podcast on iTunes. Thank you. Goodbye.